Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Amy Apprill. She's an associate scientist in marine chemistry and geochemistry. She's at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. We're going to talk about ecology and microorganisms that surround various ecologies and creatures. So, Amy, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for having me.
So, what is it that what's the focus of your study? Is it oceans? Is it other areas? And what kind of creatures?
Yeah, so we're focused on the ocean, and we're focused on sensitive animals of the ocean, really. But we don't study the animals, we study their microbes. So about half of my lab studies coral reefs, especially coral-associated microbes, and about half the lab studies marine mammals and their associated microbiomes.
Yeah, I spoke to someone about coral. They probably referred you. I didn't realize that it's such a complicated ecosystem. I guess you have the coral itself, and then you have the algae, the other creatures that live on it, and then the other more creatures that predate those creatures, and it's like a holobionts. I guess it's like a multicellular, multi-creature composite.
Absolutely, and they're rocks, they're animals, they have plants, and then they live within the most biodiverse environment in the ocean too. So there's a lot going on with corals and coral reefs.
So if there's a typical coral, what's it made of? Like, what is the bone of it made of?
Yeah. So they grow calcium carbonate skeleton, so it's actually aragonite, and they have their own tissue layers that are soft, fleshy tissues made of some of the same types of tissue layers and cell layers that you might find in other animals. And then the other really cool thing that they have on their surface is a mucus layer. So they're basically surrounded by slime. And this is their main protective layer against the other organisms that surround them. And so kind of one of the neat things about a coral is when you look at them on a reef, they don't have anything sitting on them. Like there'll be a lot of other organisms, like even sponges that might have, a little shrimp or a little fish sitting on them. But corals, you rarely have that. So that mucus layer plays a pretty important role. And those are just the parts that we see.
Well, if I dove down and I broke a piece of coral off, the internal structure, is it soft, and is it like a circulatory system, or what does the interior of a piece of coral look like?
Yeah, so it's actually this big gastrovascular sac or cavity, and so there's it's can hold fluids, and fluids can move between the different polyps that corals have. So they actually are colonial organisms. That are composed of, just depending on the species, tens of thousands of different polyps that are all interconnected by their tissues. And so, so the inside of it is fleshy, but the base of it, that's the rock. That's the aragonite that makes the reef structure, that makes the hard reef, which provides a lot of habitat for other animals.
And then the slime, is that a biofilm of, is that coral cells themselves, or is it a biofilm of, some bacteria that just happens to hang out next to the coral?
Yeah, it's a combination. So the corals are producing this like proteinous polysaccharide type substance. It's kind of similar to the mucus we make in our bodies. And then it's heavily colonized by bacteria. And we think that those bacteria are also providing protection to the coral. It also seems to be that the composition of that mucus is helping farm the bacteria, recruit certain bacteria that live there, and those bacteria in turn play this protective role for the corals by producing antibiotics and other kinds of inhibitory substances for pathogens.
So the mucus is really complex, and it's composed both of coral cells and of its own microbiome bacteria.
Exactly, right.
Huh. Are there any like photosynthetic creatures that are also part of the slime, or do they sit on top of it or adjacent to it?
Well, these corals have photosynthetic algae in their tissues, so they're intracellular symbionts. And then within that mucus layer, they don't typically have a lot of photosynthetic organisms. So sometimes you can get photosynthetic bacteria near corals. They do eat those photosynthetic bacteria, but they don't tend to hang out on the slime so much.
Yeah, what does the coral eat? And what waste does it produce? And
yeah, those are all great questions. So the corals get about 80 or 90% of their nutrition from these algae in their tissues. So these are photosynthetic algae. They're harvesting light's energy. They're making carbohydrates, glucose that are feeding the coral. But they can also eat, and they do ingest. It was always thought that they ingested like zooplankton, like fairly like larger animals on reefs, small-ish large animals like shrimps. But recently we've seen evidence that they're also eating bacteria, which are way more abundant on the reef than the shrimps. And so they also seem to be specific and like the more nutritious bacteria that they're ingesting. So that's
how do they ingest them? Do the bacteria get enmeshed in the slime and then internalized into the cells? Like, how does it eat?
Yeah, so they have these they have tentacles that the coral is putting up into just the water right above them, and those tentacles have stinging cells called nematocysts on them, and so that's one mechanism they use to capture and bring in the prey, stun the prey, and bring them in. And so it does seem to be like there's some choice, though, in what the coral is doing. So they have some ability to recognize what might be tasty or not. But it does seem to be a pretty active process. But then things are definitely getting caught in the slime, and they're likely being ingested through the mouth as well.
So if you have a coral, let's say it's like, I don't know, it's not straight, but it's 5 feet long. Do you think that, one end of the coral communicates to the other end internally through its backbone or its internal skeleton, or is there exterior stuff that's released that floats and then other parts of the same coral pick it up? I mean, do you think it has a sense of self, that it is one thing, or is each cell, it's weird. How does it structure itself? How does it know how big to get, where to go, where to grow, et cetera? Any insight into that?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, they're incredibly complex creatures. As colonial organisms, they do have some sense of what the cells nearby are doing. And so a pretty typical reaction to a coral, if it's disturbed, either like an animal where it happened to come by very closely, or a diver and it had its tentacles out, it would bring them in, and it would bring them in kind of in this very synchronous way, wave almost across the surface of the corals, sort of like a wave going through a stadium. So the communication appears to be within the closest cells.
And does the coral have roots? I mean, it seems to be like a plant in a way, or like a fungus, mycelium. Like, on the ocean floor, it has to anchor.
Yeah.
So does anyone look below the ocean floor and see if it's different? Does it have roots?
It doesn't really have roots. So it cements itself with that aragonite to generally rocks or some kind of a harder substrate on the reef. Even dead coral can be a place where the coral anchors itself. And so when they settle, they're actually single polyps. I mean, they're actually planktonic larvae. So when these things are, when they reproduce, they'll either spawn eggs and sperm, or they actually will pop out full-grown larvae. And so then that larva has to find a place on the reef to settle. So we think that there's chemical sensing that goes on with the coral and, the place that it finds. But there's recent evidence that also suggests that they might be able to hear in a very different way than you and I hear. It's particle motion, so the motion of the water, and that particle motion is partially made up of fish noises. So we also think that corals might be able to sense some of those acoustic cues, which would help them find a reef that might be more inhabited by life, they might be more successful there than a vacant reef that doesn't have any other life.
So you're studying particularly the microbiome of the coral, or the virome, or what?
Exactly, yeah. So I focus on the microbes. So it's lucky that I know anything about the actual coral itself to tell you about.
Well, okay. So in different parts of the coral, have you sampled to see if there's different microbes that hang out at at the anchor points versus the points where the nematocysts come out? Do the nematocysts themselves have certain microbes that associate with them? How much sampling have you done to look?
Yeah, so within the coral, we found that there's different microbes that inhabit that mucus layer, then inhabit the tissues, then inhabit the skeleton. So those three areas are distinct. Within the tissue layers, it's been more challenging to study on that kind of level, so we don't have as much understanding. We've done some microscopy of the bacterial communities that we've detected, and so we find some that are like heavily concentrated around on the tentacles, even around the nematocysts, and sometimes we find others within the gut cavity. So it really suggests that they have different roles within the coral depending on where they live. And kind of one of the most exciting things, I guess, I've been involved in helping discover is that many corals have basically the same bacterial symbionts that live with them. So we've known for a while that they have some of the same algae in their tissues, but the bacterial community was always seen as this like really diverse community. And we've shown that there's these specific bacteria belonging to this genus Endozoicomonas, and the name actually means endo is living within, zo, an animal. And indeed, these Endozoicomonas live within the tissues of many coral species throughout the world. And so it does seem to be a really conserved relationship that they have.
So what big questions are you trying to answer specifically about the bacteria, like their role in keeping the coral alive, or, I don't know.
Yeah, so the role in coral health, that's a pretty big one, and their role in nutrient cycling as well. So corals live in a pretty deficient, in terms of nutrient, a pretty nutrient poor region of the ocean, yet there's this tremendous amount of biomass. So like I live in Cape Cod here off the East Coast, and the waters are just super nutrient rich, but they're not nearly as biodiverse as a coral reef. And so we think that the bacteria and then the relatives, the archaea, which are also similar size microbes, play a pretty big role in that nutrient cycling on coral reefs. What we've been working with a lot in my lab is looking at the microbes that live in the water above and right next to the coral. So studying the coral microbes itself has been challenging for just a lot of reasons. But for years, folks have had great methods to study seawater microbes. And so there's a student in my lab that discovered a whole microbial community basically living within the 30 centimeters surrounding corals. So like from the surface of the coral, just out 30 centimeters. And then she found a microbial community there that's so different than if you were to look just a meter off that reef, if you were to go up even higher from the coral. And so we think
that's what I was going to ask you, right? If the water is not super, I don't know, if it doesn't move a lot, what does the water look like, half an inch off the surface of the coral? Is it different from an inch or so away, or 3 inches away?
Yeah, so I mean, visibly the water looks the same to you and I. And if we were to measure a lot of the bulk macromolecules and nutrients, like they're basically similar as well. But microbes can be more sensitive indicators of that environment than we can even acknowledge using some of our chemical analyses. And so the community itself changes. And so the microbes living right next to the coral are generally what we call copiotrophic microbes. So these are microbes that like fairly high nutrient environments. And then if we go just a meter off that coral, we find more of these oligotrophic microbes. So they don't need as many nutrients to survive. They're used to surviving in lower nutrient conditions. So we think that the coral itself is exuding molecules into that water that's kind of farming these microbes that are living there, causing them to grow. And then the other cool thing is that in that zone around the coral, we found a lot of cells that can live as symbionts with corals. So potentially the coral is also helping recruit its bacterial symbionts to come and live with them by exuding these chemicals.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Oh, you think it's releasing chemicals into the ambient water, and that attracts it? They're carried by the currents, I guess, and there's a gradient, and that attracts bacteria and other creatures.
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of motion on a reef, even though it may look quite still. There's a lot of boundary currents, and so there's some recruitment that happens just on that coral colony level, but also those molecules are swept across the reef. And then we're also working with a chemist, Elizabeth Kujawinsky. She's also, her lab's right next door to mine at our institution. And she has really sophisticated methods to identify some of these metabolites. Some of them are known, some of them are totally unknown. We can just measure their mass to charge spectra with mass spectrometry. But what we're trying to do is determine, what is the chemical composition of coral reef water look like? How does it differ between healthy and not so healthy reefs? And then also ask some of these questions about are microbes in the water growing off some of these compounds that the corals are exuding. So it's pretty exciting.
Have you studied artificial reefs or dead corals to see if they're truly dead or what activity is going on there? Compared them?
Yeah, so we've definitely studied some reefs that are not as healthy. So they don't have nearly as many corals on them. They have a lot more of this fleshy macroalgae. And then we've also been studying this invasive kind of crust. It's a crustose coralline algae that's moving over a lot of the rocks and dead coral. It's actually even overgrowing and killing coral on some Caribbean reefs. It's called Ramacrusta. So we're also trying to understand why it's so successful, and is part of its success just due to the molecules that it's producing, and are those molecules capable of killing the coral itself? So
have you observed, I know I asked you to characterize it 2 seconds, but even amongst healthy corals or amongst corals in different oceans, et cetera, how much difference is there? Is it tremendous? Even ones in the same ocean that are maybe a few meters away from each other, what have you observed?
Right. So as far as coral communities go, the hosts, we have different coral species living in Caribbean and Pacific reefs. So that's been due to just the geographic separation between the oceans. But then the coral community that you have, for example, we've been working a lot in Cuba on some of those Cuban reefs, does definitely differ based on the physical flow environment of the reef. So the corals, there's corals that are more adapted and do better in reefs that have a lot of energy on them, have like waves breaking over them. And then there's other corals that tend to be these like really large mounding corals that grow really well in the lagoon environments with still have some water motion, but not nearly as much. So physical oceanography, the flow of the water, the delivery of nutrients plays a role in what kinds of corals grow there.
Are there any animals that tend to, rub up against the corals? And if so, have you looked at their microbiome to see if there's a transfer and a persistence of it?
That's a good question. Where are all these microbes coming from? There's so many other organisms on the reef that could be carrying them. We haven't done much of that research in my lab yet. I've seen a couple other studies by like parrotfish that do graze on coral and the interaction and delivery of microbes there. I have a colleague too that's studying the cleaning symbiosis on coral reefs. So there's these cleaner wrasses and other species that will basically pick little parasites and dead skin off some of the larger fish on the reef, such as the grouper. There's a potential that there's a lot of microbial transfer going on in those kind of interactions. Both these fish are like defecating on the reef. They're contributing microbes that are raining down on corals that way too. So there's just like a plethora of microbial interactions on a reef. And we've just kind of we're at the tip of the iceberg of really even characterizing some of these relationships.
Any other animals that are of particular interest to you that maybe appear to be, ones that spread bacteria from one place to another?
Let's see. Well, I think migratory reef fish are fairly interesting as well, especially those that go between different reef environments. They have the potential to really spread microbes between reefs. I guess invasive organisms too, that's something I think a lot about now. I mean, unfortunately, we're focused so much now on like negative changes in the ocean. And so, these invasive organisms such as lionfish, sometimes these sea stars can grow to densities that are unhealthy. So all of those organisms as well, when they reach like a capacity that we're not used to seeing on a reef, have the potential to really change some of the microbial relationships and interactions that are happening in those environments. And then the big invasive species is humans. And so we know that we have ourselves a big impact on these reefs. Not so much, the one or two people a year or a month, snorkeling on these reefs, but it's really when there's development nearby, if there's a reef that's just heavily, seen by hundreds of tourists a day. I mean, we all are then contributing to various disturbances in that environment, including disrupting just the normal microbial relationships that some of these organisms like corals have.
Are there any corals and spots that would help you study those areas, like corals in dead zones, corals in places that have been overfished, corals in places that have algal blooms, and any correlation if so?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we've been doing some of that work with our research in Cuba, which has some of the most protected coral reefs in the Caribbean. So like just one of the things that I really wanted to do with my science, of course, I wanted to go and dive really nice places. That's like really my secret. But I also wanted to get an understanding of like what a healthy coral reef looks like, not only from a visual standpoint, but also from the microbial ecology standpoint, because basically the baseline, the normalcy has changed for many of these reef environments, especially those in the Caribbean. And so Cuba and reefs in this region called the Gardens of the Queen in southern Cuba provided us an opportunity to kind of like go back in time a little bit and see what a healthy coral reef looks like. And so we compared that to the Florida Keys, which is one of the most disturbed reef ecosystems in the Caribbean. And what we found is, just the seawater microbes alone were really different. So those in offshore Cuba, off those reefs, had just so many more of the photosynthetic microbes in the water than those in Florida. And those are the microbes that are really the base of that food chain. They're providing all this primary production to the waters, even though they're really small cells. They're really substantially important to that ecosystem.
Has anyone tried to take photography or video of a coral and then make a 3D rendering, see if it grows according to certain rules as a structure?
There's definitely a lot going on right now with 3D rendering and photogrammetry of corals, but predictions of growth, I don't know. That's a good question. I haven't seen anything along those lines yet, but that doesn't mean it's not happening.
Well, I mean, I'm picturing the coral that sees the sun filtering down through the water. Then there's an underside. And then if coral grows above other coral, then you're going to have stuff that's blocked, just like a forest. So I would think there'd be a preferential movement of certain microbes, like the juiciest, most photosynthetic spots versus others.
I see. Okay. So can you predict what the microbial kind of community or landscape is throughout different parts, different topography?
Well, also too, let's say you want to rehab a coral, one that's been broken, or you want to make a artificial one. I bet you there's going to be an idealized structure that would be most conducive to microbes, the right spacing, the right size, the right dimensions, a certain percentage of them can have photosynthetic access. Like what does the ideal structure look like and why?
Right. Well, I mean, right now we know that these, Gardens of the Queen reefs provide some more of that structure. So some of that are these elkhorn corals. These are endangered corals in the Caribbean that provide a unique habitat structure. So there is actually a lot of structure there that could be studied in more detail. And then, our longer lived corals, which are really important as far as reef building themselves as well, are very mounding. So there's definitely gradients in light, temperature, even oxygen that develop in those kinds of habitats. And really that hasn't been studied in great detail in relation to these microbial communities.
Yeah, it'd be hard to study it too, but I'm sure it would affect them big time. If you have a coral sitting on the ocean floor, the coral pieces near the ocean floor probably be very different from the ones that are hanging up high. What if they're 10 feet above them? They're in a very different environment with currents and with fish and access and everything than stuff on the bottom.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's part of how differential species distribution, is related to the light environment and to the water circulation. But I guess for going back to the microbes, it's really like the coral species itself has a big impact on what microbes surround it. And so there seems to be some kind of hierarchy in what's important to the microbes. And I think the host chemistry, the exudates coming off, probably plays even a bigger role than some of those other factors that are more oceanographic, at least for the microbes that are living in pretty intimate association with the corals.
Well, very good. Anything you sense that you're getting close to a breakthrough on in terms of understanding them?
Well, we're trying, that's for sure. We're certainly putting as much technology and expertise into these studies as we can.
Well, very good. April, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work?
Oh, so I have a website at the on the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution website where we call ourselves WHOI, WHOI. So if you go to that webpage, you should be able to find my lab website, where the Microbial Ecology for Ocean Conservation Lab, since we work on these sensitive animals and ecosystems of the ocean. And I'd be very happy to have more visitors to check out our science.
Well, very good. Well, thanks for coming, April. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.